Welcome everybody. We're just going to wait a second as people come in. We've had a lot of people register, so I can see the numbers going up on my screen. So give a second whilst the participants get into the webinar. I mean, what I can say is good morning to all those joining us from the Americas, and good afternoon to all joining from Europe, and good evening to all those joining us from Asia. Let me, in the first instance, introduce myself. I'm David Hillman. I'm Director of Stamp Out Poverty, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. As people are arriving, I can give a quick rundown of the proceedings. I'm going to give some opening remarks to sort of set the context of the webinar before inviting Ariba Hamid from Greenpeace to give a welcome. And after that, our four panelists will then speak for about 8 to 10 minutes each. That's firstly going to be Sindhu Sharma, who will present the climate damages tax report. Then Ugandan climate justice activist Vanessa Nakate, followed by Mohamed Adal, CEO of PowerShift Africa, and finally Yusuf Hussein from the government of Kenya, speaking on behalf of the International Tax Task Force. Laurence Tubiana sends her apologies, but at the last minute was called away to a ministerial meeting, and so Yusuf has stepped up. So thank you, Yusuf, for filling in. So our first hour is mainly going to be presentations, after which we'll move into the Q&A session, which will be for about 30 minutes. Just as a note, to ask questions, please use the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. If you could say who you are, so give your name, give your organization if you have one, ask the question, and please indicate who you would like, which panelist you would like the question addressed to. All right, well, I see a number of people are now in, and so without further ado, I'm going to launch into my opening remarks to set the context for this webinar. For those of you who just joined, I'll say again, I'm David Hillman. I'm Director of Stamp Out Poverty, and Stamp Out Poverty has been working in the field of new and additional sources of finance for climate and development for almost 20 years. There's not much we don't know about the taxing of globalized activity, be it finance, be it aviation, shipping, and now fossil fuels. We helped in the last few years. We helped give rise to the air passenger duty that over the years has raised billions to fund UnitAid, which provides AIDS, TB, and malaria treatments. Our work on the financial transactions tax, the Robin Hood tax campaign, some of you know about, has seen France, Italy, and Spain introduce small versions of that tax, raising 20 to 30 billion euros in the last 12 years. This is nowhere near as ambitious as the potential that's offered by such mechanisms, where those with the broadest shoulders can be paying for those most in need. But what's really important about this work is, and the fact that these things have taken place and happened and these levies have come into being, is the proof of concept. We've effectively seen these ideas being piloted and they work, but today we've only seen micro versions of them. That's why today is a really exciting day, a day when we get to throw a huge idea into the mix with the climate damages tax, which could raise tens of billions in additional no-cost finance to boost the revenues of the Loss and Damage Fund. And it's exciting as well because of the timing. Today, we are on the eve of the first board meeting of the Loss and Damage Fund, exactly at the point when they're addressing the scale of finance needed to make the fund fit for purpose. So let's remind ourselves of the extraordinary journey that's got us here. In 2021, at COP26 in Glasgow, loss and damage was still a toxic subject in the UNFCCC negotiations. But thanks to the outstanding efforts of climate campaigners, including many joining this webinar today, indeed a star amongst them joining us on the panel today, Vanessa Nakate, by COP27, loss and damage had become recognized as an issue the world had to take seriously, had to do something about. And if we fast forward to today, after historic agreements at COP27 and most recently at COP28, the Loss and Damage Fund was agreed by countries of the United Nations with its first board meeting tomorrow to start the crucial work to ensure funds are mobilized at the earliest possible time for the relief, recovery, reconstruction, and rehabilitation of communities devastated by climate change. And remember, this is a climate change that these communities, these populations did not cause. A climate change caused by the fossil fuel industry, who have to date gotten away without paying for the consequences of their actions. At its heart, the climate damages tax proposal is that the richest, most economically powerful countries with the greatest historical responsibility for climate change pay up first, furthest, and fastest to support populations most severely affected by climate impacts through greater taxation of their fossil fuel industries. We will shortly hear from Dr. Sindra Sharma, co-author of the paper, who will talk us through the climate damages tax proposal in greater depth. But first, it's my great pleasure to invite Ariba Hamid, Joint Executive Director of Greenpeace UK, to welcome you to this webinar.
Thank you, David. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here and for making the space to attend this webinar and have this important conversation. I wanted to thank Stamp Out Poverty and also other campaigners who've been working on this report. But like David did, just a moment to express deepest gratitude for campaigners who've come before us, who've made loss and damage an embedded principle when it comes to climate conversations. I myself have been working on climate for nearly 2 decades now, and there were times when it really felt like this was not going to happen, that the essential characteristic of the climate crisis is the inequity within it. And we need to recognize that if we are going to fight it as a global community, and to embed that as a principle, that inequity, that principle that people who are on the front lines of suffering climate impacts did very little to contribute to it. That basic principle is the driving force of these conversations. So a big congratulations and gratitude for all those who engage in those conversations, who lobbied, who produced papers, and who campaigned tirelessly to get us to this point. And of course, now the job is to make that loss and damage fund deliver on the needs of the people and those communities who are still looking to build resilience, to build their to mitigate the impacts that they've been going through. And that's why this conversation today is so important. I wanted to also begin by saying that we are every year looking at the hottest year on record. As we speak right now, we've just witnessed floods in Dubai that were unprecedented. My own home country, India, is going through an extreme heat wave, as are other countries in Asia. And we often think about this, and we know that the attribution science is now becoming quite clear, and we know this is happening because of climate impacts. The weather is becoming more unpredictable, the impacts are becoming higher in frequency and their intensity. But we often leave out who are the actors who are making decisions that are making these climate impacts worse. This is where the fossil fuel companies come in. We have no more need for science or data left that is telling us that we shouldn't be looking for new oil and gas. We shouldn't be drilling for new fossil fuel sources. We can either have a livable planet or we can look for more oil and gas. However, the fossil fuel industry has decided to ignore that advice. In fact, at times they have actively hidden the science. We know that Exxon knew it long before and actively hid it from government and from its investors and from public. Even after the science being clear, these companies have been lobbying to water down climate restrictions. They have been they pretended for a bit they cared about net zero and climate change, but actually, if you look at what they're doing, they continue to expand on oil and gas, which is going to continue to drive us into these climate impacts. I wanted to bring attention to two things that came recently. One from 2019, actually, not so recently. Mr. Ben van Beurden, who used to be the CEO of Shell, called for action to address unsustainable consumption patterns, citing consumers who choose to eat strawberries in winter. And he also talked about recycling as a way of cutting down emissions. This is the CEO of Shell, ex-CEO of Shell, of course. And there is no evidence that things have changed since then. Just last month, oil and gas companies gathered in the United States of America to talk about climate and energy. And Amin Nasser, who's the chief executive of Saudi Aramco, said, we should abandon the fantasy of phasing out oil and gas and instead invest in them adequately. The reason why I bring these things up is because it tells us where the industry is. The industry has chosen a side. They are going to max out oil and gas till it is giving them profits. They don't really care about climate impacts. And this is why we need to treat them as such. The make polluters pay principle is pretty much well established in international law now. And it is time that we treat the industry as such and we treat those polluters as responsible for climate impacts. This is where this report comes in. I think this report is an elegant policy solution to address this problem, to make sure that the people who are responsible for climate impacts are actually paying for it. And I look forward to hearing the details from the panel. I also want to add that it's a very easily adaptable model, especially by OECD and G7 countries. We're not looking to build out new laws or pass new legislation. The domestic taxation legislation that exists can be used to deliver these sums of money that can go into loss and damage fund. Also, these funds can be used for just transition away within the OECD countries, because we also know that we need to take these workers along in oil and gas industry if we are going to transition away from fossil fuels in a just and equitable manner. So I think this solution is very easily adaptable. And it comes, as David says, as a good time where there's a board meeting tomorrow. So the timing is perfect. And then last word about public support. We know from public opinion polls in the UK and from other countries that there is a huge public support, whether it's for windfall taxes on the profits that oil and gas companies are making or for banning oil and gas. There is a huge support. The public understands that this is a fight between the fossil fuel industry that is fighting for its vested interest and the rest of us. We share a uniformity of experience sitting in different parts of the world and facing climate impacts. And we need to use that pressure and leverage that pressure to make these companies stop drilling and start paying. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariba. Thank you very much for those words. Indeed, we do think this measure is popular. It is the right measure at the right time. It's no doubt that the fossil fuel industry have been making excessive profits for a long time. And as well, thanks for raising the issue of the just transition element that's inside of this proposal, the domestic dividend. And indeed, we will now hear more about the CDT proposal in greater depth as we now have a presentation from co-author Sindra Sharma. To introduce her, Dr. Sharma holds a PhD from LSE, where she sat at the Grantham Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. She currently serves as a senior policy advisor at the Pacific Islands Climate Action Network and strategy lead at the Loss and Damage Collaboration. Sindra, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for that kind introduction, and I hope you can see my screen. Can you
Yeah,
see
we
my
can
share
see you.
screen? Yes, okay, perfect. Okay, Nisa Bulavinaka and kia ora, everyone from Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's a real honor to be amongst us distinguished speakers today, and I'm really excited for the opportunity to share with you the updated Climate Damages Tax or CDT report. So we're really grateful to our partners and especially David and Julianne Richards and their thought leadership at the inception of the idea of the CDT. And today we'll explore the urgent need for the CDT, its structure, what it can offer, and its vital role in mobilizing large-scale new and additional finance quickly and equitably. So without further ado, we'll begin with an undeniable reality, and that's the rapidly shrinking carbon budget. Starting in 2023, global fossil fuel emissions had already reached a new peak at nearly 37.4 billion tons, setting us on a path to exceed the 1.5 threshold well before 2030. This stark reality is compounded by our dwindling carbon budgets for 1.5, 1.7, and 2, which you can see here. These are just numbers. These are really a countdown to irreversible climate impacts, and our calculations likely underestimate the urgency as they emit some sources like military emissions, and we're also critically not very aware of potential tipping points. And actually, this is devastating for all, but especially for developing countries and the most vulnerable amongst them, like small island communities, like where I'm from, Fiji. The reality is that we are already experiencing significant impacts. For the Pacific, it's a consistent loop of recovering or trying to just deal with what is lost. How can we think of food sovereignty when our narrow stretch of land has been inundated by salt water? What will grow? And what will happen when the science is telling us that at 1.5, 70 to 90% of our coral reefs will be gone? Wealthy nations are better able to absorb losses and damages than developing. So the concept of loss and damage has been really a crucial part of climate discussions or COPs for decades and have been formally recognized as really essential for global climate policy. It's about acknowledging that communities worldwide, especially vulnerable ones, are already facing irreversible damages from climatic changes beyond those that can be adapted to. And we have really strong evidence now through the various scientific reports, but most recently, the IPCC. The call for a dedicated fund for loss and damage was proposed more than 3 decades ago by the Alliance of Small Island States. So as David has already taken us through, finally at the 2023 climate conference, COP28, this fund was operationalized with 700 million in funding being pledged at the opening of the COP. The fund's first board meeting, as David mentioned, is tomorrow. So we have waited a really long time, but it should have come sooner. And if it did, things could have been different for communities like those in Pakistan. So I wanted to just take you through a very brief example. The horrific floods in Pakistan in 2022 incurred over 30 billion in losses and damages. We're talking millions that have been pledged, but it was billions experienced. It affected millions, it worsened poverty levels, and Pakistan's plea for aid mostly brought loans, increasing economic strain and indebtedness. If we had a well-conceived, grant-based loss and damage fund, or the acronym I'll use for that is LDF, this could have offered a no-cost recovery funds, significantly helping affected communities. The first board meeting of the new fund marks a really crucial juncture for ensuring the fund delivers climate justice. With this guiding star of rights and justice, it's vital to explore various mobilization streams, and the CDT offers one in a set of viable methods for contributing predictable, new, and additional finance, which is crucial for addressing climate impacts. Annually, hundreds of billions are going to be necessary. And and this isn't optional. For effective recovery and resilience in affected areas, we really do need that scale, that sort of scale of finance. So who should foot the bill? And we've already heard a little bit about this. No surprises here. The answer points directly to the fossil fuel industry. The sector is a primary driver of the climate crisis, has profited immensely whilst externalizing the cost of massive environmental damages. And the CDT is one mechanism through which these corporations can be held financially accountable. We need to ensure that the profits earned at the expense of our planet are redirected towards addressing loss and damage and also funding the transition. So moving on to the climate damages tax, the CDT establishes a direct link between the extraction of fossil fuels and the devastating impacts that it leads to. So extractors are held accountable, contributing to a fee on each ton of fossil fuel extracted based on its emissions profile with ratchets to the fee annually. And you can see our recommendations on the screen of a rate of $5 per ton of CO2 equivalent, increasing by $5 a ton each year. So the CDT leverages existing systems, and you can see in this diagram the various steps that we propose. In step 1, the fossil fuel companies report extraction volumes to their national tax authorities, which is a well-established process. And then through steps 2 to 4, based on these volumes and their CO2 equivalent, a CDT remittance is calculated and collected by the Loss and Damage Fund. This streamlined approach really ensures efficiency and fairness, and importantly, a portion of the collected funds directly addresses loss and damage. In step 5, the LDF remits back a portion of revenue to the country of extraction for investments in, for instance, the just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels and helping communities in that transition. So the CDT is really about more than just generating revenue. It aims to embed the true costs of fossil fuels into market prices and naturally discouraging their use. So using those well-known incentive structures that we are aware of. So by accelerating the shift towards renewables, the CDT also complements broader climate strategies like carbon pricing and other taxes and levies, some of which David already took us through in the intro. In a year that's focused on taxation, reform, and also innovative climate finance, the CDT really champions the polluter pays principle. And it's crucial that developed nations with the historical emissions lead by adopting the CDT, demonstrating a real commitment to climate justice, a real commitment to equity. All right, so this is a lot to take in, but I wanted to take you through the potential for revenue generation through the CDT, which is actually quite substantial. But I want to also stress again that this is one measure in a basket of measures. So because of the scale of needs. So in terms of concrete numbers, upon its introduction in 2024, with a starting base rate of $5 per ton of CO2 equivalent, the CDT is projected to raise approximately $44.6 billion in its first year for the Loss and Damage Fund when applied to OECD countries. Scaling up with the tax rate increasing by $5 per ton annually, the revenue for the second year is expected to surge to $90.1 billion, and by the third year to $119.8 billion. And if we apply the domestic dividend of 20%, then we'd see 11.2 billion, 22.5, and 29.9 billion, respectively, going back to facilitate the just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels. So briefly on the domestic dividend. These numbers really underscore the critical financial backbone that the CDT could provide, not just for international solidarity for loss and damage, but also for empowering economic transformation within its own borders and really thinking about making polluters pay. By reinvesting the domestic dividend into the just and equitable transition away from fossil fuels, we can drive innovation and development within our own borders, creating a sustainable model that benefits all. This must be, of course, really coupled with those good policy and governance, and also a strong regulatory environment. But it is definitely a very strong potential. And this is my last slide. When tackling the climate crisis, the mantra of first, furthest, fastest underscores the urgency and responsibility for developed nations based on principles that are enshrined in the Paris Agreement and the Convention. So the UNFCCC, that's the Convention of Equity. And these countries, with their historic emissions and resources, really must lead by adopting strategies like the CDT. This approach emphasizes that the most developed should act first, push the furthest in their commitments, and move the fastest in implementing climate solutions. This isn't just about fairness, it's about effectively leveraging their capacity to make a substantial impact on global climate action and moving us all together at the same space. To date, they have not adequately delivered as depicted in the mismatch of flows and needs in this figure from the IPCC. And in this year, when tax reform is on the agenda, when we are thinking so fundamentally about climate finance and the new collective quantified goal, which is a successor to the never delivered 100 billion, and asking where the money comes from, then the CDT really looks necessary in a world of ever escalating impacts. So this isn't just about policy, it's a promise to the most vulnerable and a commitment to the generations after us who will inherit the planet we leave behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Sindra, for a really excellent whistle-stop tour through the proposal. That was really great, and that really sets the scene for the rest of the webinar. We'll move swiftly on. Next, it's my great pleasure to introduce Vanessa Nakate. Vanessa is a Ugandan climate justice activist and UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, making history as Uganda's inaugural youth climate striker and founder of the Rise Up movement. She's renowned for her international advocacy, shedding light on the urgent climate challenges facing Africa. And indeed, Vanessa, it'd be good to hear from you about the experience of climate change in your country and on your continent. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Very happy to speak here today. My country, Uganda, has one of the fastest changing climates in the world. And we've seen a number of climate disasters, from floods to intense droughts that have affected so many people. But this goes beyond just what's happening in Uganda. It extends to other African countries as well that have seen some of the most brutal impacts of the climate crisis. And we know who is responsible for this crisis. We know what is responsible for this crisis, and that is the fossil fuel industry. I believe that, everyone on this call probably is aware about the different disasters that have been happening on the African continent, from intense droughts to cyclones to floods, among others. Heat waves that have really distracted the livelihoods of so many people, that have led to the loss of lives, that have led to the destruction of people's property, people's sources of income. And that's really what makes climate change an issue that doesn't stand on its own. It's an issue that affects every other sector of people's lives. Because when you talk about climate change, you're talking about food security, education, among others. We saw how countries are, closing schools because of extreme heat, and this is affecting the education of students. So climate change is really not a single issue. It's one that impacts different areas of our lives. So that's why it's really important that those that are responsible for this crisis should do something about it, should be able to contribute to the money, for example, that is needed to address loss and damage. I think that it's high time that fossil fuel industry, which is most responsible for causing the climate crisis, is made to contribute the billions that are needed, because we know that the money that is needed to address loss and damage is not in billions, because the impact of loss and damage it's in billions. There is an article that puts it at 1.5 trillion. So it's really important that we push the fossil fuel industry to make a contribution for the crisis that they have caused. We saw that there was a progress to set up and operationalize the loss and damage fund at the last two COPs, but all this will count for nothing if it does not sufficiently meet the needs of the people that are on the front lines of the climate crisis. And these needs are urgent, these needs are pressing, these needs are increasing. We obviously saw money being pledged for this fund, but the money was in millions and not billions. It's not enough for to address the problem that many communities are suffering from right now. And also, when you think about the replenishment of the fund, the sustainability of the fund, there are a number of questions around that, because as we've seen in this year, we've seen the different disasters happening in different places all at the same time, disaster upon disaster. That means that one time contributions to the damage fund are really not enough to address the crisis. So for me, as a climate activist, it hasn't been a very easy journey, I believe, for many of us to continuously talk about the stories of the people that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, but also to be faced with a lot of criticism, and also to be faced with a lot of disappointment and discouragement from leaders based on the decisions that are made. I think many of us know how Scotland, for example, is unable to fulfill the climate pledges that were made, and how that is devastating for people that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, the UK itself. So it can be very hard, especially when you've seen what is happening on frontline communities, when you've seen how livelihoods are being lost, how communities are being destroyed, and yet governments are still not treating the climate crisis as a crisis. And what does it really mean for them to treat it as a crisis? It's not just to address the issue of loss and damage, but also to address the root cause of the problem. Because if we address loss and damage, but don't address the root cause of the climate crisis, then that means we are going to have more loss and damage in the same communities that are already being impacted. So it's really important that as we, call for finance for the loss and damage fund, or finance for adaptation, because even that is very, very important. If there is no enough finance for adaptation, that means that there's going to be more loss and damage as well. So I think that these are three things that go hand in hand if we are to ensure justice for the communities that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, to address loss and damage, to address adaptation, but also to address the root cause of the climate crisis. When you find yourself in a ditch, the first thing to do is to stop digging. So we need to stop digging. We cannot have any new fossil fuel investments if we are to have a fighting chance, if we are to really address this crisis. We need governments to scale up on a transition to renewable energy, and to make sure that this transition is just and it doesn't leave anyone behind. We don't want to move from an extractive fossil fuel industry to an extractive renewable energy industry. So it's really important that we address all the justice aspects when we talk about climate solutions, and those are really my 3 points for this webinar today, to be able to address the root cause of the climate crisis, that is fossil fuels. Because if we do not stop digging, then we are not going to be able to address this crisis. And adaptation, we need to address loss and damage. I think the three of them we need to address them together, so that we can get the justice that the communities that are on the front lines of the climate crisis need, and justice for those that have already lost a lot because of this crisis, but also preservation of resources and a clean and healthy planet for the coming generations. Because at the end of it all, this we received this planet from a previous generation. We hand it over to another generation, and we have to make sure that the needs of this generation are met and justice is served for frontline communities. But we have to also ensure that the coming generations have a place that they can call home. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you so much for your words. I want to make just two observations. I want to come to the point that Vanessa said about keeping fossil fuels in the ground. I think it's really important to say that one of the premises of the paper is that we clearly say that what we want to see is no more drilling, no more fossil fuel extraction, but because it's not going to happen overnight, in the interim, it is correct to tax this industry on its extraction, and in a way, by doing that, help accelerate a shift away from fossil fuels to renewables. And so it's really important to assert that premise, as well to go to your point about all the progress that we've made in the last couple of years and what we've achieved in the COPs. You're right, it will count for nothing if the fund is not sufficiently capitalized and does not do the job that it's been created to do. And so that is why the CDT, the climate damages tax, is such an important intervention at this time. So let's, without further ado, move on to our next speaker. I'm very pleased to introduce Mohamed Addow, the founding director of PowerShift Africa. For almost 2 decades, Mohamed has been deeply involved in the international climate and energy issues, including advising states and the African Group of Climate Negotiators in multilateral negotiations on climate change. Mohamed, we look forward, as ever, to hear your reflections.
Hi, David. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, we can.
I'm not sure. Thank you. So first thing first, thanks so much for putting together this great paper. And there are a couple of things that I would say. Some of the first things are the positives. And then I'll also give a few words of caution about the carbon damages tax. And I'll start with the positives. We'll all agree that despite fossil fuels being the main cause of the climate crisis, the fossil fuel industry has avoided responsibility for this long. And for many decades now, we've only been focused on demand side emissions reduction efforts, largely bottom up, nationally determined. And we've learned after Paris that even with the best effort, the aggregate effect of these contributions puts us on a pathway to 2.4 degrees and more. And the fossil fuel industry and its power has continued to grow without meaningful intervention. And so with meaningful taxation, I think it's possible that we can actually make a difference. But let's also recall that, instead of actually taxing the fossil fuel industry, we've been, in fact, subsidizing this industry to the tune of billions of dollars globally. And so this is the cruel irony of our global politics. Rather than actually penalizing, this industry that has got us into the problem in the first place, we continue to facilitate them. And so we need to see fossil fuels phase out. And I think I agree with Vanessa, the phase out of fossil fuels as the end goal. And so the object here must not be to tax them, to get some money, to do some good things, if we're not going to actually push for complete phase out of fossil fuels. And so what we need is a strong, and a ratcheting up of ambition, so that the industry that got us into this problem can actually pay to help us get out of the mess we're in. So what are the positives of this taxation? This is a great way to raise money, and a lot of the panelists have actually spoken about this. So we're desperate for cash, and as the paper recommends, if this is introduced in 2024, even at a low initial rate of $5 per ton of CO2, increasing by $5 every year, we're likely to get up to 900 billion by the end of this century. And that's a great thing. And so since we're desperate for cash, particularly for loss and damage, it's a great way to raise it. It also can be a great way to actually reaffirm that important principle of polluter pays. Those who have got us into this mess, who will bear the greatest responsibility, have actually avoided taking responsibility. And with such tax, I think we will be effectively putting, the historic polluters to pay for the harms they've caused. And so in a world where we're struggling to even realize that important principle of equity and common but differentiated responsibility and respective capability, this is a great way for us to actually reaffirm this important principle. And it's also a great way to diminish the social license of fossil fuels and reaffirm that they are in fact damaging. And so that second word, damages, is critical. And so this will effectively then mean that they deserve special taxes. And this is what we're introducing here. I think the more power we hold against this industry, and the more we can actually frame it as damaging, the better to help to get us finally out of the mess. And it's also a great way to build popular support for climate tax by taking money primarily from companies, because the way it now works is we're taking money from the end users. And so centering this and going after the oil and gas companies is a great way to ramp up the cost of fossil fuels and in effect make renewables even more cost efficient. Because we're now subsidizing fossil fuels, it gives the wrong impression that renewables, even though the prices of renewable energy technology is dropping, that they're not cost competitive against fossil fuels. And so such a taxation will actually help ramp up the cost of fossil fuels. And so I'm all up for it, and it's a great thing to do. But then there are a few things that I also wanted to share, and these are my cautions. Taxing big polluters without regulating them means that we will end up, getting a small source of revenue to pay for the things we want, like loss and damage. But this can easily be a slap on the wrist for polluters with a lot of opportunities for creative accounting. And so I want us to be thinking about these damages, the CDT, in terms of not just funding climate action. The reason we're actually going for this taxation mustn't be because we are desperate for cash to fund climate action, which is important, but it needs to be accompanied by a coherent set of binding rules that forces these companies to decarbonize and phase out fossil fuels. And I strongly believe if we don't have these strong rules that effectively regulate these companies out of business, we will be guaranteeing them an opportunity for them to become powerful and profitable, which will continue to hurt us. Let me explain this a bit. If you have such a tax, which is what we need, it must not be a license for these companies to continue polluting. We must guard ourselves against framing it that once they pay the tax, then continued production is legitimate or even preferred. We can't afford to allow oil and gas companies to say, well, we pay our taxes. What more do you want us to do? There is a potential here, something we've seen with the carbon credits, some potential issue with people buying carbon credits and then calling themselves net zero. If you allow them to pay the taxes, then the argument may follow. What more do you want from us, given that we've paid the taxes you've asked us? And so the object of the tax must be to actually regulate these companies out of existence. And so keeping focus on the idea that tax is actually a stepping stone towards a phase out, not a justification not to phase out, is something that must be central to our thinking. Now, the second thing I will say, which is another word of caution to my fellow campaigners, is that a low tax can also be misleading. I can understand why we need to introduce the tax at $5 a ton and then increase at $5 a year. But that is not the true social cost of carbon emissions. We all know that the cost of carbon emissions is in the hundreds, if not thousands of dollars per ton. So it's important to keep the numbers low, given our current global politics, to keep them feasible so that we can be able to pass it through. But it's necessary for us to also safeguard ourselves against misinterpretation that the tax accounts for the damages, the true damages, which we know are much higher than the tax that we're proposing. So even though we're using carbon damages tax, what we're proposing initially doesn't meet the actual cost of the damages. And so we need to be careful so that this doesn't create that misinterpretation. The third caution I will throw into the mix is this is unlikely to be sufficient. And so we need to also guard against the framing that if this tax is paid, then that is the same as reparations or paying the climate debt that is owed. We're proposing a tax and we all recognize that it's not retroactive. So it does nothing to account for the historical responsibility and the demand for reparation. So this isn't a problem with the tax itself, so that I can be clear. And I'm not saying that the tax needs to be adjusted to cover this, but I think it's important for us to make clear that this isn't a tax that will actually result in countries avoiding to pay for the damages or the responsibilities over time. So that sort of clarification is important. And then a domestic tax dividend is interesting, but I want to say it's also potentially controversial. It makes sense politically to keep a certain percentage, like the 20% of the tax for domestic transition in the polluting countries as currently proposed, because it will make the proposal more attractive to citizens in those countries. But let's be clear, it will, if you think about it, this will be spent for countries to benefit from their own pollution in the name of a climate damages tax. I think we need a careful narrative work to ensure that it doesn't come off as if rich countries contributing to themselves in the name of loss and damage will be acceptable. And so how we frame and how we communicate and what sort of narrative underpins it, because if you're going to say, for you to fund loss and damage work, take 20% of the share of the tax. I think we need to be thinking what that might actually mean. And then finally, the governance. If you have a central fund, which companies have to pay directly to which, they bypass, national treasuries or revenue collectors, then you risk also undermining these countries' own tax processes. So what does it mean? If you're asking a country here to contribute to a central fund, which is what we want because we want them to contribute to the climate damages fund, to the loss and damage fund, what does it mean for us to also ask them to bypass and contribute directly, but then still retain 20% for their own treasuries? So we need to go through local treasuries and revenue collectors in the different countries, how they run, what are the risks, and in some of these countries, who has influence over these processes. And then there are also other global funds, where governments contribute money. So it would be interesting for us to think through when we tax oil and gas companies, and what are the sort of governance we need to build so that these decisions are also owned by the countries, so that those decisions aid the phase out. If I was only out for the cash, clean cut, CDT, the carbon damages tax, straight to the loss and damage fund to support loss and damages would be perfect. But the reason I'm up for this important taxation is so that I can actually tax these companies out of existence. And if that is the motivation, then what it does to the domestic politics in those countries, to the extent that it actually helps these countries to be able to deliver those coherent set of binding rules that over time helps them to decarbonize, becomes as important. Taxing polluters without those regulatory frameworks that actually forces them to decarbonize, is not going to mean that we will deliver our 1.5 world, which effectively will mean we'll have more loss and damages, and whatever money we can actually be able to collect through a 5%, a $5 tax on every ton of carbon is going to be minuscule against the scale of the damages the world is going to face. And so how we square this with the actual ambition we're seeking as we get some cash for the immediate, climate action that desperately requires support is important. And then as somebody in the global south, when you tax companies, what do? They transfer to the users. And in this case, how do we actually avoid that transfer to the users, especially if that is not done in a manner that is differentiated between the historic polluter and the developing countries, is another question that I have in the back of my mind, to make sure that the rules that actually help us secure these damages tax effectively enable equity and fairness in a way that we can actually be able to stand behind the eventual tax. Those are some of the comments. I'm generally broadly in support, fully, because going after the polluter is important, but do it in a way that we can actually secure our end goal, which is decarbonizing the global economy. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Mohammed. As ever, excellent points, very thought-provoking. I just want to observe a couple of things before we move to our next speaker. The principle of making the polluters pay. I mean, the positive things that you were pointing out, the diminishing of the social license of the fossil fuel industry, the popularity of the measure, but also how important it is, and you're absolutely right, how we need to be careful about how we craft the narrative and how we have to absolutely make the arguments about how this is not going to end up penalizing the end user. But it's important to emphasize that the launch of this paper is not the end of the climate damages project, climate damages tax project. It is the start of the campaign to make it happen. And so more work will happen on the narrative. I absolutely take the point that this must not be seen as a license to continue polluting. And again, that needs to be crafted very strongly into the narrative. And finally, to say, yes, it's not going to be sufficient. Absolutely, the climate damages tax on its own will not be sufficient. But that's exactly why we're going to move on to our next speaker, where we talk about complementary taxation measures that will be necessary, and a very exciting initiative that is beginning to do with that. Just before I introduce Yusuf, I'd like just to remind people we will then be moving into our Q&A section. So please use the Q&A function you'll see at the bottom of the screen. Please give your name and your organization if you have one. Put your question and say who you would like, which panelist you would like the question, or panelists you would like the question addressed to, because we will be collating those and getting them ready for the next phase of the webinar. So without further ado, I shall move to our final panel speaker, and that is Yusuf Hussain. By way of introduction, Yusuf is Climate Finance Advisor in the Office of the Special Envoy for Climate Change under the Executive Office of the President of Kenya, and is here representing the government of Kenya in their role as joint lead with Barbados, Brazil, and France of the International Tax Task Force. And Yusuf, if you can maybe put on your camera, we can see you. I'm hoping that there you are, great. And your sound. And would it be good? It would be good to hear from you about the political space that is opening up to explore new and additional complementary sources of finance for climate and development in the context of the task force that I believe had its inaugural meeting recently in Washington at the time of the spring meetings. The floor is yours, Yusuf. No, we can't hear you. Let's just check your sound. Okay, I'll try again. Well, we haven't got your sound. Bear with us while we get this right. No, have you got? Maybe what we could do is move to the Q&A and come back to you.
David, can you hear me now?
Yes, now I can hear you. Now you need to maybe turn off the other one because you get an echo. That's it. Okay. Now let's see if you got volume.
You can hear me?
Yes, yes, indeed we can. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you for the kind introductions, and thanks to all the speakers who spoke before me. I just want to start by saying that what Mohamed Abdo was talking about is very relevant, and that is what we envision and try to answer and look for solutions for in this international task force that was first proposed at the Summit for New Global Financing Pact in Paris in June 2023, and reaffirmed by the African leaders Nairobi Declaration from the African Climate Summit in Nairobi in September 2023, with a single aim of urgent needs to mobilize resources, to mobilize new, additional, predictable, and adequate financial resources, in addition to the current commitments to fund global public goods, like the support for developing and vulnerable countries in their development, and the transition to low carbon and nature positive economy, while addressing the adverse effect of climate change, including loss and damage. Is also equally important, as well as global inequalities. It's equally important and relevant that many countries are facing budgetary constraints aggravated as a result of cascading and connected crises that have affected the global economy. That said, our strategic objective is aims to bringing together global coalition of countries to identify new ways to raise additional finance through taxation in an equitable way. With the aim, our ambition aim is by COP30 to promote international agreements on one or several tax options where countries will commit to implement a tax at domestic level or in international relevant forums to allocate part of the revenue to climate action, domestically for climate vulnerable countries and through climate finance for developed countries. The task force will focus on fostering political will and advancing various options for international taxes, serve as a multilateral space to discuss and study specific tax options, bringing to the light the potential impact of such measures and assessing the best ways to ensure inequality in design and via reallocating resources. So what are we saying? We are saying the band of new taxes that we're discussing the whole of today. So the intention is to get polluters to pay for the cost of the action, such as taxing the fossil fuel subsidy, the fossil fuel industry, which has around 4 trillion a year profit on a levy, then charge a levy on the shipping industry and surcharge on business class and first class flights, offer more equitable ways of raising revenues to finance the response to climate action. It's on the basis of this argument that Kenya, France, and Wales came together to set up a task force on international tax that will look into these and other measures and agree on the specific proposals for raising additional climate finance by COP30. And since then, Antigua and Barbuda, Spain, Marshall Islands, Colombia, and Ireland have officially joined, and we're still welcoming new members as we want to be a coalition of ambition international international climate taxation countries. The task force is co-hosted by European Climate Foundation and co-chaired by the CEO, Laurence Tobiana, and another, we're still looking for a co-lead at the moment, which we have not recruited. And the climate tax options we are looking at is there are many of options for members to choose from, including levies on aviation, on maritime shipping, fossil fuel tax, that is fossil fuel extraction levy, or the tax on the windfall profit, financial transaction tax, and fossil fuel subsidy phase out. So these options have been set out in the terms of reference, as they will all have the potential to mobilize finance at scale. To put this into perspective, the taxes and the potential revenue we are talking about is, for example, fossil fuel extraction levy, an annual estimate of 210 billion USD, where air passenger levy will fetch between 4 to 4.5, 150 billion USD, and in the maritime around 60 billion USD, wealth tax at $1 trillion. So the delivery mechanism we're looking at right now is activating leadership across all regions, where members will act as champions in the region, continuously working to recruit new members and serve as ambassadors of the task force, and also facilitating exchanges with experts who are already identified via the expert group. The task force is supported by an expert group composed of distinguished professionals in the field of international taxation. The group includes experts from sponsoring national administrations and international institutions, and their role is to support a stock take of existing tax options and policy proposals, commission impact studies, and to respond to specific questions and queries from countries that have already proposed this task force. The experts we have so far identified include some prominent names like Professor Pascal Saint-Amand, Dr. Farah Songwe, Amar Batacha, Mr. Brian Dees, Atia Waris, Professor Fadil Kaboub, Dr. Jeremy Settle-Meyer, Dr. Logan Watts, Dora Benedict, Remy Yusuf, and amongst others. We'll also have the OECD, UNCTAD, UN, African Union represented and sit there as observers. The key research parameters for the expert groups will be an impact analysis, an impact assessment, whereby we are envisioning by June this year, the stock take of existing taxes already implemented to inform tax design scenarios will be completed, and we move to COP29, where we are looking at commissioning impact studies to further explore the economic impact of these tax options, and the research parameters for the impact studies will include around zero in revenue adequacy, international equity between countries and economic impacts, domestic equity and fairness within countries, behavioral response, linkage effects, international cooperation, and scalability of the tax structure, amongst others, plus political feasibility. The targets we have is progress on all these fronts, essentially to lay the groundwork for successful finance outcome at COP29. And we have to learn from history that setting climate finance goals without the revenue and systems to deliver on them is a recipe for disappointment. This time, we must do it differently, as many countries and leadership and climate experts see taxes as amongst the most promising so-called innovative source of financing that could help plug the large gap in the provision of climate funding to vulnerable countries. The taxes on fossil fuel extraction and the emission of the shipping industry could rise up to 210 billion and 60 billion a year respectively, according to the recent study by Climate Action Network. So we are looking at having some political, taking advantage of some political timelines towards COP30. So we had, as you alluded to, David, we had the launch of the whole initiative and the expert group, the kickoff meeting on the sidelines of the spring meetings in DC in April. So we're also looking at UNGA in September in New York, COP29 in Baku, then April, the spring meetings in DC, then the summer Finance for Development Summit in 2025, and then September 2025, the UNGA again, and then culminating at the COP in Belém in Brazil. Thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you very much, Yusuf, and it was really useful to hear about the task force, but also to hear about this timeline of occasions where this initiative is going to grow and get stronger. And it's very important that there is a political space in which ideas like the climate damages tax, the financial transactions tax, and others have a place to be incubated, a place where they are acceptable and being talked about by countries, by politicians, because this is an area that in the past ideas have come up and they've been they haven't been given political space. So that in fact is it kind of shows that we are in a critical decade, this decade running up to 2030, where we are acknowledging the climate emergency and different ways in which to respond to it. So it's in the spirit we now move on to the Q&A. Please do put more questions into the Q&A you see at the bottom of the screen. And as I say, if you could let us know who you are, your organization, and who you would like the question aimed at. But to start with, I have a couple which I think are important for Sindra because they're more about the proposal itself. The first question is from Nicholas Omanuk here from End Fossil Occupy Uganda. So the question is to go to someone well versed with finance. I was wondering if this tax could also apply to stakeholders in the fossil fuel industry, especially financial institutions. So I don't quite sure how how that would work, because we have ideas about the FTT. But if you could have a look at that. Excuse me. There was also a question about would the climate damage tax also apply to fossil fuel companies extracting in the global south, for instance, Nigeria? So if we could start by looking at that, and then if the other panelists could also maybe come, let's have a if you put your videos on so we can see you, then we can have more of a panel, and just keep yourselves on mute for the moment until you're brought in. But over to you, Sindra.
Yeah, thank you, David. And for the first question on if it could be applied to other areas, especially finance, I actually did answer that question, thinking that the form it would take would be the financial transactions tax, which can take different forms within that as well. So I think it is feasible, and as David had also mentioned, and others as well, that the CDT would be in a basket of other measures, right? Other taxations that could really drive forward the need to keep it in the ground. And the second question was, I'm just trying to find it. Do you mind repeating the second question, David?
So the second question was
If it applies to the global south.
yeah, would it apply in the global
Yeah.
south, would it apply to Nigeria, was the question there.
Yeah, so in the paper, we unpacked this a little bit. We wanted to ensure that it stayed within the concept of CBDRC, so common but differentiated responsibilities, and that those who have polluted the most should go first, furthest, fastest. But it would apply to any point of extraction, right? And we offer that if it's within a developing country, then the revenue potential, the revenue generated, would remain within the country. But it is the portion from developed countries that will go towards the loss and damage fund.
Thank you very much for that. Next question is for Mohammed, and then other participants who might want to come in. Do put your cameras on so we can see you. So Mohammed, when arguing about the climate damages tax, should we avoid using language like reparation, historic responsibility, and so on? Because as you said, it doesn't address those injustices. This is a question from Ellis Brooks.
Yes, thanks, David. Absolutely, it doesn't address any of those things. And so calling it anything else would be just misleading. And the reason I'm raising these things is it's not retroactive. It doesn't go back to account for the historic responsibility of these companies and the harms they've caused over these many years. And so this isn't going to be reparations. And so we need to be guarding ourselves in using framings that may over time actually undermine the demand for climate debt. Those of us in the global south, where 80% of the global population is, and that have only used a fraction, actually less than 20% of their God-given rights to the global commons, will make a right claim for climate debt. And so those who owe the rest, climate debt, at one point will have to be, held for that. And so we don't want a situation where this gets mischaracterized, and companies will say, what, we've paid our taxes, and those of us who will then claim those debts, gets pushed back, and these responsibilities go unfulfilled. And so we need to be careful in what we call it. I think it's only fair we call what it is, which is tax. And I think there's a question of whether it's actually damages tax, because if you're only initially levying $5 a ton, and that doesn't meet the extent of the damages that have been caused, Is it truly damages tax? And I can actually relate with, you know, the call to start introducing this tax at $5 a ton. And I will definitely get behind that. But that in no way meets the true social cost of the carbon emissions in you know, over this last century. And so even using the word damages, you know, when it's set that low, you know, made over time undermine the demands for the right compensation, the right tax. But there is where we are in today's politics, and that is our biggest constraint. And so we can't be naive to not realize that there are these constraints. But I want us to be making these demands with this understanding, so that when the numbers don't add up to actually help pay for the damages in the real world, we don't hold ourselves and say that we've already asked for damages and those damages have been paid, when the true damages on the ground are much higher than the tax that we're proposing now. And so these words of caution are just to help us understand, even with this, you know, what the rest will see as radical proposal isn't anywhere sufficient to the, you know, the harms that have been caused. And so that awareness, that understanding is critical. So the point I'm making is not to actually change, you know, the name of the tax from damages tax, or change the proposal of this low initial rate of $5. It's just to recognize that the real demands in the global south by, you know, vulnerable communities is much higher than that. And so I don't want us to compromise on those important demands. And that is the important flag, perhaps, to even secure this.
Thank you, Mohammed. Indeed, we do not see this as a radical solution. We see this as a modest proposal in the scheme of things. But it moves us to a question I have for Yusuf from Ian Duff from Greenpeace's Stop Drilling, Start Paying campaign. Yusuf, if you could, yeah, there you go. And which governments do you think could be the first to champion a climate damages tax or a similar tax? He asked mostly to understand where campaigners may want to focus their energies.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Daf, for the question. As it is right now, we're just pushing it as a blanket. So we have not yet gone deep down on which country and which specific taxes will work for each country. Maybe from our engagements and what we plan on the work program, that will become clearer. But the intention of those countries who have subscribed to the idea right now is they're in support of all those tax brackets we are pushing. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf. And a question for Vanessa: on which occasions on the 2024 calendar do you see as opportunities where pushing for the loss and damage fund to be sufficiently financed and ideas like the climate damages tax can get reach and get profile, so we can best maximize such a proposal as this?
Yeah, thank you very much. Some of the moments I can think of are our Common Future Summit that will be taking place. I believe in September that will be in New York, organized by the United Nations Secretary General. And I think COP29 as well would be a good moment. There could be other moments as well that I may not have on my calendar yet, but those are some of the areas that I can think of immediately. And maybe, if possible, the conference that happens in Bonn, I believe in June, I think it would also be I think it would be a good moment. But again, we shouldn't just wait for these moments that come maybe after 2 months or after 3 months. I think mobilization and awareness can start even before these moments, these events happen, so that it can help build momentum even as we head towards these events. I also wanted to add to something that Hamad said. I think that it's really important that, you know, we recognize the historical responsibility and also the current responsibility, because again, if we were to refer to this as reparations, then that means that we wouldn't just be taxing fossil fuel industries for their present, responsibility, but then would go back to make calculations on what needs to be taxed for what they have done in the past. So that's why I also think it's really important that there remains that concrete differentiation between the reparations and what is being taxed right now, so that they have no excuse to say that they have paid for damages. They have no excuse to say they have paid for their their historical responsibility when it comes to addressing the climate crisis.
Great, thank you for that, Vanessa. We are moving towards the end. We're in the last few minutes. I'll take this question and invite any of the panelists to come in to respond to it before we move to a close. Then this question is, for the panel, looking at the sort of international oil investors, how they might respond if this tax was introduced. Is it possible that such a tax would impact their dividends and their share price? And could this accelerate investor flight from fossil fuel companies in a way that is useful for the phase out of the industry? So maybe we give that to Sindra first, because it's more of a sort of a practical kind of what would happen as a consequence of the climate damages tax coming in. But as I say, we can use this as an opportunity for any of the speakers to come in and make closing remarks. Okay, over to you, Sindra.
Thanks, David, and thanks for the question, Ian. Yes, I believe that the tax would impact dividend, and it is actually something we did think about in the paper, and we tried to model against it, but it's unfortunately not included in the paper. The incentive sort of structure around the text is broader than just at the point of extraction, right? So we're very cognizant that, yes, it is a very low rate that we propose, and there's thinking behind why we chose that rate in the paper and how that would have implications to investors and also to carry on effects to consumers as well. And I believe that in proposing this low rate, it is just a proposal. We also propose alternative rates as well. So the higher you go, the more likely that you'd have the sort of effect that you're suggesting here on investor dividends. So yeah, it's definitely something that we considered in the paper, and I'll let others come in to answer as well.
Thanks, Indra. Yeah, it's important. Firstly, it would be very useful just asking the team to make sure that the link to the CDT paper is in whichever chats. They probably are there already, but whatever the audience chat is, to make sure that everybody can access the paper. Yes, to emphasize that the third annex, Annex 3, looks at the alternative base rates and different rates for the tax. So we have mapped out alternatives. And indeed, coming back to Mohammed's point, in Annex 2, we talk about the social cost of carbon and how and why we made the decision to start the rate where we did. But we need to absolutely bear in mind the ratchet, the annual ratchet, which increases the cost and ultimately disincentivizes fossil fuel production going forward. So we're in the last minute. Is there anyone from the panel who would like to say a final word before I move on to just concluding words? Feel free if you want to come in. or you may feel that you've done your time on this webinar. Well, in which case I'll move to a close. All right. Firstly, really what I want to do at this stage is just give a few thank yous. I would like to thank the core partners on this project for their support in bringing the whole of this idea into being. That's ActionAid UK, CAN International, Christian Aid, Heinrich Boll DC, Practical Action, and of course, Greenpeace UK. And really a big shout out to Greenpeace for all their great work organizing this launch webinar. There's been a team behind the scenes, but I want to give particular thanks to Joe and to Cash and to Ian. A big thank you as well to my colleague Eleanor for her great work reaching out to organizations for endorsing the paper. We have achieved more than 100 endorsements, which is a great job. And of course, a big thank you to all the organizations who endorsed. They're too numerous for us to list, for me to list. I'd like, of course, to thank our excellent panel, to thank Sindra Sharma for her presentation, Vanessa Nakate, Mohammed Adao from PowerShift Africa, and Yusuf Hussain for their time and their presentations. And a particular mention to Sindra, who's joined us from New Zealand. And I guess it's nearly 1:30 in the morning for you. So thank you very much, Sindra. Finally, a big thank you to you, the audience from all over the globe who've joined us today. And I'll close by addressing the many climate campaigners amongst you. Thank you for all that you've done. Thank you for all that you're doing. Thank you for the great work that is still to be done as we work together to make sure that the climate damages tax comes into being. So with these words, I'll close this webinar. Thank you.